So the last kind of pillar that we had was API exposure. And again, we've got the 2x2 here, thinking about intra-domain versus cross-domain. And then in terms of the x-axis, we've thought here about internal exposure of APIs versus external exposure of APIs. And the first step here from kind of total legacy is looking at internal API maturity. So how are your APIs commonplace to drive automation, again, basic automation, but also are you leveraging southbound APIs to work with vendors on assurance and work with vendors on optimization, and partly, I guess, the blurring lines here between networks and OSS. So how are you building your own internal API skills so that you can drive towards, as I said, automated assurance? And I don't know if you can read some of the quotes here, but one I'd like to call out is from the CTO of the tier one North American operator on the right, where they feel like they've got good internal API maturity, and they say, yeah, look, we've got 600 plus internal APIs ready to expose to vendors through our own API gateway and an own API marketplace. And I think it's interesting because, of course, they are mature there. They have invested in step one, but for me, what it showed was maybe they were lacking step two, which was around how to actually think about northbound API discovery, because this is about exposing in a simple way, in a standards-driven way to developers, the developer community, so that they can build APIs into their apps around the network, like they've done with CPaaS and with voice and messaging, etc. And to think about a developer being able to make sense of or leverage 600 plus internal telco APIs is chaos to me. I think that shows that they've thought very much about step one, but not so much about step two, which is how do we think about the simplicity of the APIs that we offer to help test the model for as a service and help test the model for what developers really want. So I think what's clear here is that telcos need to consider, how they take the internal API work they're doing, but make it much more simple for developers and external enterprise customers to leverage. That's the key part of what step 1 to 2 is that simplicity of the proposition. And then what you think about is, okay, well, I want to monetize my APIs at scale. And this is where you start to build a more diverse portfolio of northbound APIs, and you start to build out more availability of those, and you start to differentiate possibly even from the standards. So whereas within the northbound API discovery segment, you're probably still working within siloed product teams, but needing to become more standards driven. When it gets to step 3, you probably have a centralized strategy around APIs, and you're thinking about working with Kamara and TMF and the GSMA and with MEF on driving those standards. But you might also start then thinking about more decentralized innovation of APIs, because of course, if all telcos follow the same standards around APIs and all launch the same APIs as part of their product set, there's less differentiation, and you become a commodity based on APIs rather than a commodity based on SIMs or connectivity. So, part of what we see is that step from initial launch of standards-driven APIs to this API monetization is that you may start to differentiate, as said, within these more decentralized units and product teams that then again start creating new services and new value around these APIs. So again, the jump up here, bringing that more diverse portfolio of northbound APIs, but also bringing some level of innovation beyond the standards. And so a bit of a summary here on the right in the key recommendations. We've talked about the 5 S's of exposure, of API exposure, and these 5 considerations that you need to make to drive scale. And one of those, as we've said, is simplicity. So you can't expose 600 telco APIs because that would be a mess. Developers won't understand how to use it. You won't be able to provide enough support and guidance and SDKs and notifications and handover guidance on how that's used. So it needs to be a much more simple proposition. You need to think about how you break down silos initially so that it's not small product teams just working on this on their own and not thinking about the end customer and not thinking about the standards-driven or federated approach. But of course, you then need to balance standardization with speed of innovation and the ability to differentiate. So how do you start to work towards the standards to build up the skills, to build up the credibility with developers, to build up your own ecosystem, to then think about, now I can innovate and differentiate because I've built those skills, I understand the standards, I've been a key contributor to those metrics. And the last one, again, is security, much more on the technical side, on the architecture side. But as we move away from just network information-driven APIs like latency and jitter or location, when we move towards more network orchestrating API-driven use cases, there will be a security angle here. And so it's a key consideration. And I'm sure obviously everyone on this call is aware of that. But thinking about how you work with partners and you participate in catalysts and proof of concepts to drive towards that secure driven networking so that you can enable network orchestration or network orchestrating APIs effectively. And again, if we plot in the bubbles where different operators are, the overwhelming majority is still early days, especially when we look beyond kind of the tier ones in North America and Europe to Latin America, parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. We do see that even the internal APIs is still relatively new, and looking at how to use southbound to engage with vendors. But some more advanced, those obviously that are part of the GSMA Open Gateway initiative, thinking about stage 2, and some starting to think, okay, well, look, how do we take our skills in CPaaS, for example, with Deutsche Telekom, and leverage that in a NAS or network as a service world?